The hollow eyes of Redmoor Asylum. The rusted gate groaned a lamentation as Harper Quinn pushed it inward, a sound like a tortured spirit exhaling its last breath. It was a dying gasp that echoed through the skeletal trees lining the overgrown drive, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers towards a sky the color of bruised plums. Harper shivered, though the late autumn air held no exceptional chill. It was a cold that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her worn boots, a seep of ancient dread. Redmoor Asylum. The name itself was a whispered curse in hushed academic circles, a blight on the landscape of psychiatric history. For decades it had stood, a hulking edifice of weathered stone and fractured glass, a monument to forgotten suffering. Now it was her domain, for a time at least. Harper, a fresh-faced psychiatric researcher with a mind sharpened by ambition and a spirit fueled by an almost pathological curiosity, had been granted exclusive access. Her project, to document the overlooked human element within its decrepit walls, to give voice to the echoes of the lost. A noble pursuit, she'd told herself, staring at the proposal on her laptop screen. Now, standing before the looming silhouette of the asylum against the fading light, noble felt far too frail a word. The gravel crunched beneath her steps, each sound amplified in the profound silence. No bird sang, no wind rustled leaves, just the relentless rhythmic scrape of her boots. The building itself was a brutalist nightmare, a severe rectangle of dark granite that seemed to absorb all light, casting its own perpetual shadow. Windows, once designed to admit natural light, were now shattered eyesores, some boarded, others gaping black pits reflecting nothing but the encroaching gloom. A faint, cloying scent, a mix of decay, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, began to permeate the air as she drew closer. She reached the massive oak front doors, scarred and warped by time and neglect. A thick, rusted chain, like a forgotten serpent, was wrapped around the handles, secured by a padlock the size of her fist. Her contact, a stern-faced archivist from the County Historical Society, had left a small, tarnished brass key hidden beneath a loose stone beside the steps. Her gloved fingers fumbled, the cold metal biting at her skin even through the leather. The lock surprisingly yielded with a dry click, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of the pervasive silence. Pushing the doors open was a labor. They groaned, protested, then finally swung inward on corroded hinges, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy, a breath held for half a century. It carried the full force of that peculiar, sickly sweet scent. Harper swallowed, the taste of dust already coating her tongue. She retrieved a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from her backpack, its beam slicing through the gloom, illuminating motes of dancing dust that had likely been suspended there for decades. The main hall stretched before her, a vast, echoing space. High ceilings, once grand, were now streaked with water damage and adorned with cobwebs that draped like tattered funeral shrouds. Flaking paint peeled from the walls in grotesque patterns resembling sun-scorched skin. Ahead, a wide, sweeping staircase ascended into deeper shadows, its ornate banister caked in a thick layer of grime. To her left and right, closed doors lined the hall, indistinguishable black rectangles in the dimness. Harper moved slowly, her flashlight beam dancing across the decay. The tiles beneath her feet were a mosaic of dull gray and sickly green, many cracked and displaced. Then she saw it. On a particularly wide, unbroken gray tile near what she assumed was the old reception desk, a dark, reddish-brown stain. It wasn't just a random splotch. It was a circular pattern, almost perfectly rendered, roughly the diameter of a dinner plate. And within that circle, smaller, concentric rings, as if a finger had been repeatedly dragged through something viscous. It looked like dried blood, old, very old. A prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. This wasn't the kind of academic curiosity she was used to. This was visceral. She knelt, her gloved finger hovering inches above the stain. The color was deep, almost black in the flashlight's beam, but undeniably crimson at its edges. It didn't look accidental, it looked deliberate. A chill wind, or perhaps just a draft, whispered past her ear, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible groan, like ancient timbers settling, or something far less benign. Harper pushed herself up, her gaze sweeping the hall. The dust lay undisturbed everywhere else. This one spot, this one pattern, stood out with chilling specificity. She decided to begin her methodical exploration, starting with the administrative offices to gather any initial records, then moving to the patient wards. The first few rooms were expectedly bleak. Overturned desks, scattered paper, rusted filing cabinets. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten despair. In what must have been the doctor's lounge, a framed sepia photograph lay face down on a shattered table. She carefully flipped it over. A group of stern-faced men in white coats, their eyes unnervingly hollow in the faded image, stood before the asylum's entrance. Their gazes seemed to bore into her, a silent judgment from a bygone era. She quickly put it back down. She found a set of staff lockers, their doors hanging ajar, revealing nothing but dust and shadows. One locker, however, was jammed shut. With a grunt, Harper forced it open. Inside, hanging from a single hook, was a frayed, stained white coat. It was too large for her, the fabric stiff with age. As she pulled it out, a faint, sweet smell, the same peculiar scent from outside, emanated from it. And then she saw the tag, sewn into the collar, Dr. Alistair Finch, a name that would, in time, become a whisper in the dark. Deeper into the building, the architecture shifted, becoming more utilitarian, more oppressive. This was the patient wing. Long corridors, lined with identical, heavy steel doors, stretched into the infinite blackness beyond her flashlight's reach. The air here was noticeably colder, and the peculiar scent intensified, now mingled with something distinctly metallic, like rust, and something else, something organic, decaying. Each creak of her shoes on the loose floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. She tried the handle of the first door. Locked. The second. Locked. Most were sealed, perhaps from the inside, or simply rusted into place. She decided to follow the corridor to its end, looking for any open access points. As she walked, the dust seemed to grow thicker, clinging to her clothes, coating her lips. Her flashlight beam, though powerful, seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the immediate vicinity. She felt an increasing pressure behind her eyes, a dull ache that she attributed to the strain of focus. She reached a section of the corridor where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving a gaping hole above. The floor here was littered with debris, chunks of plaster, splintered wood, but her beam caught something else. Hanging from a robust steel beam that had survived the collapse was a length of heavy iron chain. It was unlike any she had seen in a medical facility. Thick, industrial grade, clearly designed for restraint. What sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins was that it was swinging, slowly, rhythmically, with no discernible breeze or mechanism to propel it. It moved with a lazy, deliberate arc, like a pendulum counting down to some unseen moment. Harper froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind, trained in rational thought, scrambled for an explanation. A draft? But the air was utterly still. The dust motes in her beam were motionless. She took a tentative step closer. The chain continued its eerie sway, casting elongated, dancing shadows on the grimy walls. The metallic clink of its links, barely audible, seemed to reverberate directly inside her skull. It was a sound that spoke of confinement, of struggle, of despair. She watched it for what felt like an eternity, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then, as if acknowledging her presence, it slowed, came to a shuddering halt, and hung perfectly still. The silence that followed was even more profound, more suffocating than before. Her hand trembled as she lowered the flashlight slightly, trying to dispel the image, the feeling. Rationality, Harper. There has to be a rational explanation. But the cold dread that had taken root in her gut refused to yield. She moved away from the swinging chain, her pace quickening, an urgent need to find some concrete data, some tangible evidence of human presence to anchor herself. She spotted a door further down, slightly ajar. A small, almost imperceptible sliver of blackness, deeper than the surrounding shadows, beckoned. Pushing it open, she found herself in what appeared to be a doctor's office, but one that had been ransacked with an almost violent abandon. Papers were strewn everywhere, furniture overturned, a thin layer of plaster dust coating everything. A heavy wooden desk, its surface scarred, stood in the center, still somewhat intact. On it, amongst the detritus, lay a stack of leather-bound journals, medical records. Her hands, still faintly trembling, reached for the topmost journal. The cover was cracked, the leather dry and brittle. The title, debossed in faded gold, read, "Patient Log, Ward B, Dr. Alistair Finch," the same name from the staff coat. She opened it carefully, the dry pages crackling like autumn leaves underfoot. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost elegant, despite the frantic nature of some entries. The early entries detailed mundane psychiatric observations, melancholia, hysteria, delusions. Then a shift. Harper's flashlight beam traced the words, her eyes scanning rapidly. Patient 37, Arthur Davies, admitted for severe anxiety, auditory hallucinations, claims shadows whisper from the walls. Fairly standard for the era. But then, an entry dated weeks later. Patient 37, increasing agitation. Reports, "They're watching me from the cracks." Refuses to sleep, complains of burning sensation behind the eyes. Harper felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the professional curiosity warring with a burgeoning dread. She turned the page. Patient 37, found screaming in his cell, clawing at his face, repeatedly shouting, "They want my eyes, they're taking them." Sedated. Upon examination, no discernible injury to ocular region. Delusions intensifying. She flipped another page, her breath held. Patient 37, 4 days later, found unresponsive. Eyes missing. Not gouged, not removed violently. Simply gone. Orbs vacant, lids closed over empty sockets. No blood, no discernible trauma. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, but circumstances remain inexplicable. Staff deeply unsettled, questioning the nature of the facility's environment. Harper's blood ran cold, missing eyes, not gouged, not removed violently, simply gone. The words echoed in the oppressive silence of the room. She felt a phantom sensation behind her own eyes, a burning, a pressure. She flipped through more pages. Another patient. Patient 51, Clara Jenkins, admitted for catatonia, began muttering about the hollow gaze in the mortar. Weeks later, Patient 51, found in day room, screaming, tearing at her face, crying out, "My eyes! Oh, my beautiful eyes!" And then, a few days later, the same horrifying entry, Patient 51, deceased, eyes absent, As with Davies, no trauma, no blood, just emptiness, a sense of a void. Entry after entry, the same pattern emerged. Patients exhibiting paranoia, claiming something in the walls, something unseen, wanted their eyes. Then the horrific discovery, vacant sockets, no violence, just an inexplicable, chilling absence. Dr. Finch's elegant handwriting grew increasingly ragged, his observations laced with thinly veiled fear. He wrote of strange fluctuations in temperature, of whispers heard in empty corridors, of an oppressive presence. He spoke of nurses resigning in droves, of orderlies refusing night shifts. The journal dropped from Harper's numb fingers, hitting the dusty floor with a soft thud. The sound was swallowed by the heavy silence. Her flashlight beam, which had been fixed on the journal, now wavered, illuminating the empty, desolate room. She felt an unbearable weight pressing down on her, an unseen entity scrutinizing her every move. The circular blood smear on the tiles, the swinging chain, the sickly sweet scent that now seemed to cling to her clothes, her hair, her very skin. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying understanding. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted. And the horror wasn't just a byproduct of human cruelty or mental illness. It was something else, something ancient, something predatory, something that had fed and perhaps still waited within these very walls. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from somewhere deep within the asylum, followed by a low, drawn-out moan that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the building. It wasn't the settling of old timbers. It was a sound that tasted of anguish and unspeakable suffering. Harper clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white. Her breath hitched. She was no longer a researcher, she was prey, and she was utterly alone in the hollow eyes of Redmoor Asylum. The ache behind her eyes intensified, an insistent throb. She instinctively brought a hand to her face, a primal urge to protect them, to shield them from something she couldn't see, but could now feel watching. The darkness beyond her beam seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, alive with a malevolent intent. She could feel it on her skin, cold and probing. It knew she was here, and it was waiting. The sudden, guttural moan that ripped through the asylum's core was not a sound of settling architecture. It was a cry of profound, ancient agony, a sound that bypassed Harper's ears and vibrated directly in her bones. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied echo of suffering that curdled the very air. Her blood froze in her veins. The journal, lying open on the dust-caked floor, had painted a picture of unimaginable horror. Now, Redmoor Asylum was painting it in sound, in a visceral, chilling symphony of dread. Harper scrambled backward, her hip striking the overturned desk with a dull thud. Her flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and shadows that seemed to deepen and writhe at the edges of her vision. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to turn and run back through the gaping maw of the front doors, back to the world of logic and light. But a more primal, more stubborn part of her, the researcher, the one driven by an insatiable need for answers, refused. She was trapped, not by physical bars, but by a horrifying curiosity, a dark magnet pulling her deeper into the abyss. She forced herself to breathe, shallow, ragged gasps that tasted of dust and decay. The pressure behind her eyes intensified, now accompanied by a throbbing at her temples, a dull ache that resonated with the asylum's oppressive atmosphere. She knew, with a horrifying certainty, that whatever had stalked these halls, whatever had taken the eyes of those poor souls, was not a ghost in the conventional sense. It was something else, something older, more malevolent, a parasitic entity that fed on more than just life. It fed on vision, on perception, on the very light of the soul. With a trembling hand, she picked up the journal, carefully placing it into her backpack, along with her recorder and a small digital camera. These accounts, as horrifying as they were her only anchor, her only link to understanding what she was truly up against. She had come seeking forgotten histories. She had found living nightmares. The silence that followed the moan was even more terrifying, a vacuum that seemed to suck all sound and light from the world. Harper moved, not back towards the entrance, but deeper into the ward, drawn by an unseen force. She had to find the source. She had to see. The corridor was a gauntlet of closed, heavy doors, each a portal to untold suffering. The peculiar, sickly sweet scent intensified, now carrying a faint, unmistakable undertone of something burnt, something charred. Her flashlight beam, once a strong, defiant spear, now felt like a weak, sputtering candle against the encroaching darkness. She reached the first cell, its steel door rusted shut, a narrow, grimy window barely visible at eye level. Harper pressed her face to the cold, grimy pane, peering into the inky blackness within. Nothing, just an empty, desolate space. She moved to the next, and the next. All were silent, seemingly vacant. But the air grew colder, heavy with a palpable sense of despair, as if the very walls wept the tears of their former inhabitants. Then, from behind one of the sealed doors, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It wasn't words, just a breathy, sustained hush, chilling in its intimacy, as if someone was pressed against the other side, listening. Harper recoiled, her heart leaping into her throat. She pressed her ear to the cold steel, holding her breath. The whisper ceased. Only the frantic thumping of her own heart filled the void. She took a step back, her gaze sweeping the row of doors. Was it a trick of the mind, the asylum playing on her fears, or was something truly lurking within? She continued down the corridor, her boots crunching on dust, and something else, something gritty and unidentifiable. The walls grew more stained, the paint peeling in larger, more grotesque swaths, like diseased skin. Her flashlight beam flickered, a momentary tremor that sent a jolt of panic through her. She tapped the casing. It steadied, but the incident left her rattled. She turned a corner, into a wider section of the ward. This appeared to be a common room or day room, judging by the scattered, broken chairs and tables. The space felt immense, the shadows stretching and distorting everything into monstrous shapes. It was here, in the periphery of her vision, that she first saw them. A movement, a distortion in the air, a ripple of shadow against the far wall. Harper whipped her head around, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just the flaking plaster, the pervasive dust. She dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the light. But the sensation persisted, a feeling of not being alone, of being watched from multiple angles. Then she saw it again. Not a shadow this time, but a form. It was hunched, skeletal, clinging to the ceiling where the plaster had peeled away, revealing damp, stained concrete. Its limbs were elongated, spider-like, moving with an unnatural, jerky grace. And where its face should have been, where eyes should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse, a void of flesh. An eyeless apparition, just as Dr. Finch had described, crawling across the ceiling like a morbid insect. Harper froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was translucent, shimmering like heat haze, yet utterly distinct in its horror. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head, or where its head should be, tilting as if listening, sensing. The air around it seemed to shimmer, to vibrate with a silent hum of malevolence. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her jaw was locked, her muscles rigid with terror. The apparition moved further along the ceiling, its horrific form silhouetted against a distant high window, where a sliver of bruised twilight filtered in. It was not alone. Another, then another, began to materialize, clinging to the walls, to the beams, their eyeless faces turned towards her, a silent, predatory multitude. They moved without sound, without friction, their spectral limbs scuttling over the decrepit surfaces. The sight was a violation of all natural laws, a sickening distortion of reality. Suddenly, a chorus of screams erupted. They were distant, muffled, yet piercing, originating from beyond the sealed doors of the ward she had just passed. Not whispers now, but full-throated, desperate wails of terror and pain, the kind that tear at the soul. They seemed to echo from the very fabric of the building, a chorus of the damned crying out from their eternal cells. The eyeless forms on the ceiling paused, their movements ceasing, their empty faces seeming to turn, not towards Harper, but towards the source of the screams, as if drawing sustenance from the sound. Harper pressed herself against a decaying wall, the rough plaster digging into her back. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the impossible. These were not hallucinations. This was real. The journal entries, the missing eyes, the pervasive dread, it was all horrifyingly, undeniably real. The screams subsided, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the floorboards beneath her feet. She knew she couldn't stay in that room. The apparitions, though still distant on the ceiling, were converging, their movements slow but purposeful. She had to find a safer place, a way to regroup. Her eyes darted around, searching for an exit, any escape from this unfolding nightmare. A door, partially open, beckoned from the far side of the common room. It led to a side corridor, darker, narrower. A risk, but a necessary one. With a surge of adrenaline, Harper pushed herself away from the wall and bolted, her boots pounding on the gritty floor, the sound swallowed by the asylum's hungry silence. She didn't look back, but she could feel their gazes, their hollow, unseen eyes tracking her every movement. The screams started again, louder this time, nearer, as if the walls themselves were crying out. She burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, the heavy wood shuddering on its hinges. She leaned against it, gasping for breath, her lungs burning. The corridor was utterly dark, her flashlight beams struggling to penetrate the oppressive blackness. The air here was even colder, carrying a faint, medicinal tang, mixed with that persistent, sickly sweet scent. She stumbled forward, her mind racing, adrenaline dulling the immediate terror, replacing it with a desperate need for survival. She needed to find an exit, or at least a place where she could barricade herself, where she could process what she had seen. The asylum was a labyrinth of suffering, and she was hopelessly lost within its dark heart. Hours blurred into a terrifying eternity. Harper wandered through endless corridors, each indistinguishable from the last, each filled with its own unique flavor of dread. She found what looked like a staff dormitory, a series of small Spartan rooms. In one, she found a narrow cot, its rusty springs exposed, the mattress a moldering heap of fabric. Exhaustion, both physical and mental, was setting in. The terror had been too much, too relentless. Her mind, pushed to its absolute limit, craved oblivion. She sank onto the cot, the springs groaning in protest. Her flashlight, clutched in her hand, cast a weak circle of light on the floor. She fought against the encroaching fatigue, knowing that sleep here would be a surrender, an invitation to whatever horrors lurked in the shadows. But her eyelids were impossibly heavy, her body trembling with the aftershocks of fear. The low, guttural growl seemed to emanate from the very walls, a lullaby of malevolence. Her last conscious thought was of the eyeless figures, their silent, scuttling horror. And then, A sudden, sharp pressure around her throat, a cold, unyielding grip that stole her breath. She struggled, her eyes flying open, but the darkness was absolute, impenetrable. No light, no form, just the crushing pressure. She tried to scream, to fight, but her limbs were heavy, unresponsive, as if bound by invisible chains. The world went black. She awoke with a gasp, thrashing on the cot. The flashlight had fallen from her hand, lying on the floor, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling. Her throat was raw, aching, a burning sensation that brought tears to her eyes. She scrambled up, her hands flying to her neck. Her fingers brushed against something wet, something viscous. She fumbled for her flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she finally retrieved it, she shone the beam onto her hand. It was smeared with a dark, reddish-brown substance. Blood. Her blood. With a horrifying dread, she shone the light onto her throat, then quickly angled her phone's camera to take a picture, zooming in on her neck. There, stark against her pale skin, were 5 distinct fingerprints. Dark, smeared with dried blood, they stood out in chilling clarity. And they were too large to be her own. They were the prints of a hand, larger, more defined than any human hand she knew. A silent scream tore through her. It hadn't been a dream. She had been attacked. Physically, violently, by something she couldn't see, something that had slipped through the veil of her consciousness, leaving its bloody mark. She stumbled out of the cot, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her hands, still smeared with blood, felt alien, terrifying. She needed to clean herself, to wash away the evidence of this violation. She made her way to a small adjoining bathroom, its porcelain fixtures cracked and stained. The tap groaned, then spat out a trickle of rusty cold water. As she splashed the frigid water onto her face and neck, scrubbing at the dry blood, her gaze fell upon her left forearm. In the dim, flickering light of her flashlight, she saw it. Etched into her skin, just below the elbow, was a symbol. It was faint, a reddish mark, like a burn, but not one she remembered incurring. It resembled a crude, interlocking spiral, like an eye seen from above, or a vortex. And as she watched, it seemed to pulse, to glow faintly, with a dull, internal luminescence. Her mind immediately flashed back to the asylum beds. She'd seen faint markings on some of the iron frames, scorch marks almost. She'd dismissed them as vandalism or the random decay of time. But now, seeing this symbol on her own flesh, she knew this was not random. This was a mark, a brand. The terror she had felt earlier paled in comparison to the cold, insidious dread that now wrapped around her. This place, this entity, was not merely haunting Redmoor Asylum. It was reaching out. It was marking her. And the faint glow, the symbol that burned silently on her skin, was a chilling promise of what was yet to come. She was no longer just a witness. She was becoming a part of the horror, a new page in Redmoor's bloody history. The ache behind her eyes flared, sharp and sudden, a premonition of the ultimate theft. The glowing symbol on Harper's forearm pulsed with a faint, malevolent light, mirroring the frantic beat of her own heart. It was a brand, a claim, a chilling declaration of ownership. The faint burn on her skin, the lingering ache in her throat from the unseen grip, the pervasive, sickly sweet scent that now seemed to cling to her like a shroud, it was all coalescing into a horrifying certainty. This wasn't just a place of ghosts, it was a lair, and she, Harper Quinn, had unwittingly become its next occupant. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She stumbled back into the dormitory room, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly as if expecting the unseen assailant to materialize from the shadows. The cot, where she had momentarily succumbed to exhaustion, now felt like a trap, a lure. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every creak of the ancient building resonated with a predatory intent. The air itself felt thick, suffocating, as though a monstrous entity was breathing down her neck. She pressed her forearm against her chest, as if she could somehow erase the glowing symbol, deny its existence. But it throbbed, a silent internal beacon, affirming its horrifying presence. This was not a hallucination, not a trick of the mind. This was real, and it was happening to her. Her professional detachment, her scientific curiosity had evaporated like mist in a scorching sun. All that remained was a primal, gut-wrenching terror. She was no longer an observer. She was the observed. She was no longer a researcher. She was the subject. She had to get out. The thought clawed at her mind, overriding all other impulses. But the asylum had become a labyrinth, its corridors stretching endlessly into the unknown. And the eyeless apparitions, the screams from sealed rooms, the unseen hands that had grasped her throat, they were all waiting. With renewed, desperate energy, Harper began to search for an exit. Not the front door, not anymore. She needed an escape route, a back way, a service tunnel, anything that led away from the chilling heart of Redmoor. She moved with a frenetic urgency, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the profound silence. She passed through more patient wards, their doors still mostly sealed, their interiors impenetrable. The air grew colder, the scent of decay more potent, now mingled with something else, a deep, earthy smell, like overturned soil or something long buried. The low, guttural growl she had heard before returned, a faint, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate from the very foundations of the building. It was a sound of immense, barely contained power. She found herself in what appeared to be the asylum's basement, a vast, echoing space with low ceilings and thick concrete pillars. Pipes, rusted and dripping, snaked across the ceiling, their leaks forming dark puddles on the grimy floor. The air was heavy, damp, and the earthy smell was overpowering here. It was a place of secrets, of forgotten horrors. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing shelves filled with ancient, unlabeled bottles, rusted tools, and what looked like old surgical equipment, some of it disturbingly crude. This was where the asylum's darkest practices might have been performed, far from the light of day. A shiver, colder than any before, traced its way down her spine. Then she saw them, not apparitions this time, but physical marks. Scratches, deep and deliberate, gouged into the concrete pillars. They weren't random. They formed symbols, similar to the one now burning faintly on her arm, but larger, more intricate, intertwined with what looked like crude depictions of eyes, some open, some closed, some simply empty circles. And surrounding these symbols, smeared onto the concrete, were dark, dried stains, blood. Not just drops, but smears, handprints, as if someone had frantically tried to etch these symbols using their own life force. Harper felt a wave of nausea. This was the work of patients, or perhaps staff, driven to madness, desperately trying to communicate a horror they couldn't articulate. The circular patterns from the main hall flashed in her mind, the bloodied symbols from the journal entries. It was all connected. As she moved deeper into the basement, the floor grew uneven, littered with debris. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, catching herself against a cold, damp wall. Her flashlight beam, momentarily falling, illuminated a set of thick iron shackles bolted to the concrete floor. They were large, heavy, clearly designed for human restraint, and they were still attached to something. She directed the beam lower.
Attached to the shackles, lying in a heap on the floor, was a tattered, skeletal remains of what looked like a straitjacket, and beneath it, partially obscured by dust and shadow, was a human skeleton. It lay curled in a fetal position, as if trying to escape, its bones yellowed with age, its empty eye sockets staring up at her, hollow and accusing. A choked cry escaped Harper's lips. This wasn't just a former patient, this was a prisoner, left to die in the dark, chained to the very floor. The implications were horrifying. What kind of institution was this? What kind of doctors? Then she noticed something else. Around the skeletal remains, etched into the concrete, was a sprawling, intricate version of the spiral eye symbol that now glowed on her arm. It was larger here, encompassing the entire space around the skeleton, as if drawing power from the very essence of the deceased. And scattered amidst the bones, gleaming faintly in her flashlight's beam, were tiny iridescent shards. They looked like pieces of broken glass, but they shimmered with an unnatural internal light, like crushed pearls. Harper knelt, her hands trembling, her scientific instincts momentarily overcoming her terror. She carefully picked up one of the shards. It was smooth, cool to the touch, and unbelievably light. It wasn't glass. It was something organic, something crystalline, yet fragile. And within its depths, she could almost perceive a faint, milky luminescence, like captive starlight. As she held it, a sudden searing pain erupted behind her own eyes, sharp and blinding. She gasped, dropping the shard. The symbol on her arm flared, a sudden intense heat that made her cry out. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her head, the pain overwhelming. It felt as if something was pressing, pushing from within, trying to force its way out. When the pain subsided, she opened her eyes, blinking rapidly. The room seemed dimmer, the edges of her vision slightly blurred. She shook her head, trying to clear it, but the subtle distortion remained. A cold dread, far deeper than before, began to seep into her soul. A low, guttural growl, louder this time, reverberated through the basement, shaking the very concrete. It was close, too close. And it was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a malevolent force pressing in on her from all sides. The air grew impossibly cold, and the earthy, sweet scent intensified, now acrid and metallic like fresh blood. From the deepest shadows of the basement, beyond the reach of her flashlight, a form began to coalesce. It was huge, towering, a shape of pure darkness against the faint, bruised light filtering from the distant, broken windows above. It moved slowly, ponderously, like a creature just rousing from a centuries-long slumber. Harper stared, transfixed by a terror that held her utterly still. The pressure behind her eyes returned, a relentless, burning ache. Her vision seemed to narrow, the world contracting to a pinprick. As the form drew closer, taking on a more defined shape, Harper's mind struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. It was vaguely humanoid, but twisted, elongated, its limbs spindly and disproportionate. Its skin was the color of dried blood and decay, stretched taut over a skeletal frame, covered in what looked like desiccated black scales. But it was its head, its face, that stole her breath, that stole her sanity. Where eyes should have been, there were only gaping, empty sockets. Not just empty, but horribly distended, as if something monstrous had torn its way out from within. The flesh around them was raw, mangled, a landscape of perpetual suffering. And from these hollow chasms, a faint, sickly green light pulsed, a bioluminescent glow that seemed to drink in all surrounding light. Its mouth was a wide, toothless maw, fixed in a silent, eternal scream. This was the eye-taker, the parasitic spirit from Dr. Finch's desperate notes. It was real, and it was here. It moved with a slow, deliberate crawl, its long, clawed fingers scraping against the concrete floor, a sound like fingernails dragged across a tombstone. The air around it crackled with an unholy energy, a palpable aura of ancient evil. Its eyeless face, a void of agony, turned towards Harper, seeming to sense her presence, to feel her terror. The glowing symbol on Harper's arm flared, burning with an almost unbearable heat. The searing pain behind her eyes returned, more intense than ever, a blinding white-hot agony. She cried out, a guttural sound torn from her throat. Her vision blurred, then pulsed, then began to fade around the edges, as if a dark curtain was slowly drawing across her sight. She could still see the eye-taker, its grotesque form filling her shrinking field of vision. It was extending a hand towards her, a long, black, clawed appendage. It moved with a sickening slowness, its fingers twitching, beckoning. A whisper, cold and dry, like sand slipping through cupped hands, slithered into her mind, bypassing her ears, echoing directly in the dark chambers of her consciousness.
"Welcome, harvest." The words were not spoken, but felt, a violation of her very being. The creature was not just a physical horror, it was a psychic predator. The pain behind her eyes intensified, blinding her momentarily. When her vision returned, it was even more diminished, the world now viewed through a narrow, hazy tunnel. The eye-taker was closer, its distorted face inches from hers, its hollow sockets seeming to bore into her very soul, even without eyes. The sickly green light pulsed faster, brighter, drawing her in, consuming her. She tried to move, to scream, to push away, but her body was paralyzed, a puppet on broken strings. Her vision continued to recede, the world shrinking into a pinpoint of dim light. Panic, pure and unadulterated, choked her. This was it.
This was what had happened to Arthur Davies, to Clara Jenkins, to all the countless others. It was taking her eyes. It was taking her sight. The last thing Harper saw before the encroaching darkness swallowed the final sliver of light was the eye-taker's immense, mutilated form looming over her, its hollow sockets glowing with a triumphant, malicious glee. And then there was only black, absolute, impenetrable black. The external world, the asylum, the monster, all vanished. She was falling, falling into an abyss of nothingness, her mind screaming in silent protest. The burning behind her eyes, however, remained. It was no longer a pain. It was a sensation of profound, chilling emptiness, a void where light and perception had once resided. Her sight was gone. But the entity was still there, a cold, hungry presence, not outside her now, but within. It had taken her eyes, but it wasn't finished. It had chosen her as its next host, a vessel for its ancient soul-devouring hunger. The hollow eyes of Redmoor Asylum had finally claimed their latest victim. Her journey into the darkness was just beginning. Part 4. The blackness was absolute, a suffocating shroud that enveloped Harper's consciousness. It wasn't merely the absence of light, it was an active, consuming void, a primal darkness that seemed to press in from all directions, stealing not just her vision, but her very sense of self. Her mind screamed, a silent, desperate wail against the impossible. Her eyes were gone. Not physically, she knew. She could still feel the phantom sensation of her eyelids, the hollow ache behind them.
But her sight, her perception of the world, had been brutally ripped away. She lay on the cold concrete of the asylum basement, her body rigid, paralyzed by a terror that transcended the physical. The metallic tang of old blood, the earthy dampness, the pervasive, sickly sweet scent, all these assailed her remaining senses with sickening clarity. The guttural growl that had heralded the eye-taker's arrival now seemed to resonate not from without, but from deep within her own skull, a terrifying symphony of ownership. The symbol on her forearm, the crude spiral eye, no longer merely pulsed, it burned with an internal icy fire, a constant reminder of the entity's claim. She was a host, a vessel. The whisper, cold and dry as desert wind, returned, not as words, but as a direct intrusion into her thoughts. Such clarity in darkness. It was the eye-taker, its consciousness now intertwined with hers. A parasitic tendril burrowed deep into her mind. Panic threatened to unravel her. She thrashed, a desperate, futile struggle against an unseen enemy, against an internal invasion. Her hands clawed at the air, finding nothing but empty space. Tears, hot and useless, streamed down her face, the last remnants of a world she could no longer see. As the initial wave of terror began to recede, replaced by a chilling resignation, a new, horrifying sensation began to stir within her. It was subtle at first, a faint, ethereal flicker at the edges of her internal void. Not light, not true sight, but something akin to it. She began to perceive shapes, not with her eyes, but with a different, alien sense. Shadows, movements, the skeletal remains on the floor, they registered as faint, shimmering distortions in the pervasive blackness of her mind. This wasn't her vision returning. This was the eye-taker's perception, filtered through her stolen senses, through the new parasitic link. She was seeing through its eyes, or rather, through its lack of them, through the hollow, all-consuming void that defines its existence. The world, as seen through this new lens, was a tapestry of energy and despair, of echoes and vibrations. The concrete walls hummed with the trapped sorrow of countless victims. The rusted pipes pulsed with a faint metallic resonance. The skeletal remains on the floor, once a source of terror, now appeared as a dense knot of lingering agony, a beacon of suffering. The eye-taker's presence within her mind was a cold, alien intelligence, a predatory hunger that dwarfed her own consciousness. It reveled in the despair, feasted on the remnants of fear that still clung to the asylum's fabric. And it communicated not with language, but with images, with sensations, with a profound, ancient knowing that flooded Harper's mind. She saw flashes of Redmoor's history, not as a coherent narrative, but as fractured, brutal vignettes. She saw the first patients, their minds fragile, their eyes wide with fear as the entity began to stir. She saw Dr. Finch, his face etched with growing horror, his meticulous notes becoming a desperate plea for understanding. She saw the ritualistic blood smears, the circular patterns, not as random acts of madness, but as desperate attempts by the patients to ward off the unseen predator, to blind it, to appease it, to mark its territory. The chains, the screams from sealed rooms, the eyeless apparitions, they were not mere ghosts. They were the husks, the echoes, the lingering imprints of the eye-taker's past victims, bound to the asylum, their souls partially consumed, their perceptions distorted, forever trapped in a state of eternal horror. The shards she had found near the skeleton were not glass. They were calcified remnants of stolen light, crystallized fragments of perception, physical manifestations of the entity's feeding.
The eye-taker pulsed within her, its hunger growing, stirring. It was guiding her, urging her forward, deeper into the asylum. She was no longer walking under her own volition, but moved by an unseen force, her body a puppet responding to the parasitic entity's will. Her limbs felt heavy, yet strangely agile, moving with an unnatural grace she didn't recognize. She ascended from the basement, her blind internal sight perceiving the asylum as a vast, pulsating network of suffering. The main hall, once a source of terror, now felt like a familiar, if horrifying, landscape. The dark, circular blood stain on the tile in the main hall, she now understood, was a feeding point, a place where the entity had drawn strength, where a sacrifice had perhaps been made. The asylum was a carefully constructed prison, a place designed to contain not just the mentally ill, but also to trap and nourish the eye-taker. The architects, the founders, they must have known, they must have been part of it. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. This wasn't just a brutal entity, it was an ancient, calculated evil, perhaps even worshipped. She moved through the corridors, her senses now hyper-tuned to the asylum's inner life. The whispers from sealed rooms were not just vague sounds, they were fragmented thoughts, echoes of trapped minds, cries for a release that would never come. She felt the pressure behind the steel doors, the desperate yearning for light, for sight, for the simple act of seeing. The symbol on her arm throbbed, and she felt a subtle shift in her own perception. The world, as seen through the eye-taker's lens, was beginning to change. The outlines of objects, once shimmering distortions, were becoming clearer, sharper. She could differentiate textures, perceive faint, ethereal glows emanating from certain areas, places of intense suffering, of lingering energy. It was a dark, unholy sight, but it was sight nonetheless. She was not blind. She was merely seeing through a different, terrifying filter. She was being led to a specific place, a room at the very heart of the asylum, a place that resonated with a profound, ancient power. The growl within her deepened, a rising crescendo of anticipation. She found herself in what appeared to be the asylum's deepest, most secluded ward, a wing not mentioned in Dr. Finch's journals, perhaps hidden away, forgotten. The doors here were thicker, reinforced, marked with faded, intricate symbols that pulsed with a faint, dark energy. The air was colder, heavier, saturated with an almost palpable malevolence. At the very end of this corridor, she found a massive, ornate door, unlike any other in the asylum. It was carved from dark, heavy wood, adorned with grotesque, eyeless gargoyles whose mouths were perpetually open in silent screams. The spiral eye symbol was intricately carved into its center, glowing with an intense, sickly green light that now matched the light pulsing from the eye-taker's hollow sockets. Harper's body, still under the entity's control, reached out, her hands tracing the cold, ancient wood. The symbol on her arm burned, and she felt a surge of cold power, a profound sense of connection to this place, to this ancient evil. This was its sanctum, its throne room. The door, without a sound, slowly swung inward, revealing a chamber of unimaginable horror. It was a vast circular room, its walls lined with alcoves, each containing a skeletal figure chained upright, their empty eye sockets staring into the perpetual gloom. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, was a large, intricately carved stone slab, its surface stained with ancient dried blood. And upon this slab, resting in a shallow depression, was a single, immense obsidian orb. It wasn't just a stone, it was an eye, a monstrous, petrified eye, black and smooth, yet radiating a palpable aura of immense power. And within its depths, swirling like captive galaxies, were countless tiny, iridescent shards. The same kind she had found in the basement, but here they were alive, pulsing with a faint, milky luminescence.
These were the stolen perceptions, the consumed souls, gathered into a single terrifying repository. This was the eye-taker's true form, its heart, its essence. As Harper's gaze, or rather the eye-taker's gaze through her, fell upon the obsidian orb, the entity within her mind surged with an almost ecstatic hunger. The growl intensified, becoming a triumphant roar that echoed through her very being. The ground began to tremble. The skeletal figures in the alcoves rattled, their chains clinking a ghostly symphony. From the alcoves, the eyeless apparitions began to coalesce, shimmering into spectral reality, not as the hunched, scuttling forms she had seen before, but as full, translucent figures, their arms outstretched, their empty faces turned towards the obsidian orb, towards Harper. They were reaching, yearning, drawn by the immense power of their tormentor. The eye-taker within Harper began to exert its full control. Her body shuddered, convulsed, as if an invisible force was tearing at her from within. The glowing symbol on her arm blazed with an agonizing heat. The pressure behind her eyes returned, but this time it wasn't pain. It was a sensation of immense, unbearable expansion, as if something was being pushed into her, filling the void that had once been her sight. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed against her temples, her mind screaming in protest as the entity's power surged through her. She felt its ancient hunger, its predatory glee, its profound connection to the obsidian orb. It was feeding, not on her eyes, not anymore. It was feeding on the raw psychic energy of the asylum, on the trapped souls of its victims, on the very despair that permeated every stone. And it was using Harper as its conduit, its anchor to this world, to this feast. Her vision, this new alien sight, began to clarify further. The world pulsed with vibrant, terrifying energies. The apparitions, once vague, were now horrifyingly distinct, their features contorted in eternal anguish. She could see the threads of their former lives, their broken hopes, their stolen perceptions, all being drawn towards the obsidian orb, absorbed, consumed. The eye-taker spoke again, not in whispers, but in a booming, resonant voice that echoed directly in her mind, a voice that was both ancient and utterly devoid of mercy. They serve me. You will serve me more. Harper screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the asylum's hungry silence. She was not merely blind, she was bound. Not merely a host, but a conduit, a tool. The eye-taker's presence within her deepened, its cold, alien consciousness merging further with her own, twisting her very essence. She was losing herself, piece by agonizing piece. The hollow eyes of Redmoor Asylum had not just taken her sight, they were taking her soul. And the terrifying truth was, she was beginning to see the world through their hungry, empty gaze. The ultimate horror was not just her blindness, but the dawning realization that she was becoming one with the very thing that had taken it. Her transformation was far from complete. Part 5. The blackness was no longer absolute. It was a canvas for a horrific alien perception. Harper, collapsed on the cold stone of the sanctum, felt the eye-taker surge within her. Its consciousness an icy torrent flooding her mind, drowning her own thoughts. Her body convulsed, a mere shell animated by an ancient predatory will. The glowing symbol on her arm burned like a brand, a permanent inscription of her new terrifying fate.
The world, as seen through the eye-taker's hollow gaze, was a tapestry woven from despair and residual energy. The skeletal figures in the alcoves were not just bones, they were pulsating nodes of trapped anguish, their empty eye sockets radiating a faint violet luminescence. The apparitions, once vague, shimmering forms, were now terrifyingly distinct. They were not mere phantoms, but translucent husks, each etched with the final, agonizing expression of their stolen perception. They writhed, silent screams on their featureless faces, drawn towards the obsidian orb in the center of the room, their ethereal bodies stretching, yearning. The obsidian orb itself was the epicenter of this grotesque symphony. It pulsed with a deep, sickly green light, a living, breathing entity. Harper, or rather the eye-taker through Harper, perceived it not as stone, but as a dense, swirling vortex of captured light, of stolen sight, of consumed souls. Within its polished surface, she could see countless iridescent shards, the crystallized remnants of perception she had found earlier, swirling like trapped stars in a black galaxy. Each shard was a fragment of a life, a moment of vision, forever imprisoned within the eye-taker's heart. The eye-taker's consciousness, now almost fully integrated with hers, communicated not with words, but with a torrent of ancient memories, of cold, primal urges. It showed her its origin, a terrifying glimpse into a time before time, when it was merely a thought, a hunger in the void, drawn to worlds where life flourished, where light and perception were abundant. It was a parasite, an existential predator, its purpose singular, to consume the essence of sight, to feed on the soul's capacity to perceive. Redmoor Asylum, she now understood with a sickening clarity, was not just a convenient hunting ground. It was a perfectly designed trap, a centuries-old feast. The asylum's founders, the first doctors, they hadn't just built a hospital, they had constructed a cage, an incubator. The spiraling symbols carved into the asylum's stone, the blood smears, the carefully chosen location, all were designed to attract, to contain, and ultimately to feed the eye-taker. The patients were not merely suffering from mental illness. Many were sacrifices, offered up, their terror and their stolen sight fueling the entity's growth. Dr. Finch's frantic notes were not just a doctor's descent into madness, they were the terrified observations of a man who had stumbled upon the asylum's true, horrifying purpose. The eye-taker, through Harper, began to move. Her body, still trembling, slowly rose from the floor, her limbs obeying an unseen command. She walked towards the obsidian orb, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, the symbol on her arm blazing with a furious heat. The apparitions in the alcoves pulsed, their ethereal forms stretching further, dissolving into strands of violet light that snaked towards the orb, merging with its sickly green glow. They were not just echoes, they were living batteries, their lingering energy being siphoned, consumed. As Harper reached the dais, her hands, no longer her own, rose and gently touched the surface of the obsidian orb. A jolt, not of pain, but of immense, unholy power surged through her. The eye-taker within her roared, a silent, triumphant sound that shook the very foundations of the asylum. The orb pulsed violently, its green light intensifying, illuminating the grotesque carvings on the walls, making the eyeless gargoyles seem to leer with malevolent glee. The climax was not a physical struggle, but a spiritual one, a horrifying communion. The eye-taker was using Harper as its anchor, its conduit, to draw the full, concentrated power from the orb, from the accumulated centuries of stolen sight and consumed souls. Her body became a focal point, a living lens through which the entity channeled its ancient energies.
Harper's consciousness, though battered and submerged, fought a desperate, futile battle for control. She saw flashes of her own life, her ambition, her drive, her desire to understand. All of it was being twisted, corrupted, absorbed into the eye-taker's monstrous hunger. Her research, her noble pursuit of knowledge had led her here, to this unholy apotheosis. The walls of the sanctum began to crack, thin fissures appearing in the ancient stone, radiating outwards from the dais. A low, guttural groan, deeper and more resonant than any she had heard before, emanated from the very structure of Redmoor Asylum. It was not a sound of decay, but of transformation, of rebirth. The asylum, having served its purpose, was changing, becoming something more, something darker. The apparitions, their energies fully drained, began to dissipate, dissolving into nothingness, leaving only the clinking of their empty chains. The skeletal figures in the alcoves crumbled, their bones turning to dust, their suffering finally, irrevocably extinguished. The eye-taker was not just consuming, it was cleansing, preparing for a new phase. As the last apparition faded, the obsidian orb pulsed one final blinding time. The sickly green light exploded outwards, filling the sanctum, burning into Harper's alien perception. She felt a tearing sensation, not of flesh, but of spirit, as if a part of her was being ripped away, yet simultaneously something new, something cold and vast was being born within her. When the light receded, Harper stood alone on the dais, her hands no longer touching the orb. The obsidian eye was still there, but its vibrant glow had faded, replaced by a dull internal shimmer. It had been drained, its power, the cumulative essence of stolen sight, had been transferred into her. The eye-taker's presence within her began to recede, not vanishing, but settling, a dormant, watchful entity now fully integrated into her being. The burning symbol on her arm, however, pulsed with a steady internal light, a living, breathing brand. Harper closed her eyes, or rather where her eyes should have been, for she felt them still. When she opened them, the world was no longer seen through a hazy, alien filter. It was sharp, clear, vibrant, but profoundly altered. She saw the sanctum, the cracked walls, the empty alcoves, but she saw them not as a human would. She saw the lingering echoes of suffering, the pathways of energy, the subtle tremors of fear that still clung to the stone. She saw the essence of things, not just their physical form. A sudden, sharp pain flared behind her eyes, a searing, white-hot agony that brought her to her knees. She gasped, clutching her head, but the pain was quickly replaced by a profound, chilling emptiness. She brought a hand to her face, her fingers brushing against her eyelids. They were still there, physically, but when she tried to focus, to perceive the world with human eyes, she saw nothing but black. Her vision, her true vision, was gone, irrevocably. The eye-taker had not just temporarily blinded her, it had consumed her natural sight, replacing it with its own parasitic perception. She was seeing, yes, but not as Harper Quinn. She was seeing as the eye-taker saw, through hollow sockets, through a void of empathy, through a lens of pure hunger. The realization dawned, cold and brutal, tearing through the last vestiges of her human consciousness. The eye-taker had indeed chosen her as its next host, but not merely a vessel, it had chosen her as its successor. It had completed its cycle of consumption in Redmoor, drained the old power source, and now, infused with its essence, Harper was the new eye-taker. She felt the ancient hunger stir within her, a cold, insatiable craving for light, for perception, for the vibrant essence of living eyes. The growl was no longer within her mind. It was a low, resonant hum in her chest, a primal thrum that yearned for sustenance. She stumbled out of the sanctum, her steps now purposeful, driven by an instinct that was no longer her own. The asylum was silent, dormant, its purpose for this eye-taker cycle fulfilled.
But Harper was awake, her new senses fully engaged, perceiving a world teeming with potential sustenance. She reached the main hall, her blind, hollow gaze passing over the circular bloodstain that had once terrified her. Now it felt like an ancient, familiar landmark. The rusted gates, the skeletal trees, the bruised plum sky, they all called to her, not as a researcher seeking answers, but as a predator seeking its next meal. As she stepped out of Redmoor Asylum, the first rays of a weak morning sun touched her face. She felt no warmth, no light, only the cold, persistent hunger that now defined her. Her physical eyes, though seemingly intact, were hollow, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything.
The symbol on her arm pulsed faintly, a silent promise. Harper Quinn was gone. Only the hollow eyes remained, seeing a world of endless targets, a world ripe for the taking. The Eye-Taker had been born anew, and it was walking out of Redmoor Asylum into the unsuspecting world, ready to continue its ancient, brutal harvest. The horror was not contained. It had merely found a new vessel and a new beginning.